Family, there comes a moment in life when the noise of the world grows louder than the whisper of God. And in that tension, we are faced with a choice. Do we follow the familiar path, or do we dare to step into the unknown road He has carved out for us? Purpose is never found in comfort. It is discovered in surrender. And today, I want to remind you, your destiny is not random. It is divinely orchestrated. God is calling you to walk in alignment, to step into clarity, and to embrace the assignment that only you can carry. Obedience is the bridge between revelation and manifestation. And when we pause to truly meditate on this truth, it changes the entire lens through which we see life, purpose, and faith. Revelation is the divine download, the whisper from God, the insight into what He has called us to. But revelation on its own is incomplete if it does not find a body. If it does not translate into action, if it does not become something tangible that shapes the trajectory of our lives, too many people remain at the stage of revelation, celebrating the vision, holding on to the promise, but never moving in obedience to that word. And as a result, they live with unfulfilled potential, with dormant dreams that never become reality, with prophetic insights that are never birthed into the earth. Obedience is that crucial middle ground, the very bridge that carries us from the moment God speaks into the moment when His word becomes flesh in our lives. When God speaks, He often speaks in seed form. He plants an instruction, a direction, a call, or sometimes a burden that we cannot shake. It rarely comes fully packaged or neatly explained. It comes as a whisper that demands trust, as a nudge that pulls us out of what feels safe, as a command that does not always make logical sense. Revelation is beautiful, but it often confronts our logic. It demands faith. But faith without works is dead, and obedience is what activates faith. To hear God and not respond is to keep the seed in your hand without planting it in the ground. That seed has potential, but potential alone does not feed nations. It is only when the seed is released in obedience that it grows, multiplies, and manifests into what God originally intended. Many of us pray for manifestation. We cry out for breakthrough. We ask God for doors to open. And yet the very key He has placed in our hands is obedience. It is easy to worship in the revelation, easy to get excited about the promise, easy to write it down in journals and declare it out loud. But the test of maturity, the test of devotion, is whether we will walk it out even when it costs us, even when it stretches us, even when it positions us in uncomfortable spaces. Every great move of God through a life has always been on the foundation of obedience. Noah obeyed to build when there was no rain. Abraham obeyed to leave when there was no map. Mary obeyed to carry what she could not fully explain. Jesus obeyed to endure what He could have refused. And because of obedience, what was spoken by God became what was seen by humanity. The danger of ignoring obedience is that revelation becomes delayed manifestation. The Israelites had a promise of a land flowing with milk and honey, but because of disobedience, what should have taken days became 40 years. Disobedience always prolongs destiny. It does not cancel the promise because God is faithful, but it delays its fulfillment. When God reveals, He reveals with intention, with timing, with alignment. When we obey, we step into His rhythm and we allow His timing to become our reality. When we delay obedience, we step out of rhythm, and though His grace can redeem, we lose time. Time is a gift, and obedience is what redeems the time we have been given. Obedience is not only about what we do, but also about how quickly we do it. Delayed obedience is still disobedience because it shows that we trust our timing more than God's. Many times God instructs us in moments where the environment does not look ready, but obedience is the act of trusting that He has already gone before us, that He has already set the stage, that He is not asking us to move without preparing the way. Obedience is not blind, it is visionary. It sees beyond what is visible and agrees with what God has spoken, even when our eyes cannot yet see it. Some of the greatest blessings in life are locked behind acts of obedience that seem small. Sometimes it is a phone call to a person you don't know why God is placing on your heart. Sometimes it is stepping into a project that feels bigger than your qualifications. Sometimes it is forgiving someone you would rather hold a grudge against. Sometimes it is walking away from something that feels comfortable but is no longer aligned with your purpose. These small acts of obedience carry weight in the spirit, and they become the bridges that connect the revelation God gave you with the manifestation you have been praying for. Nothing God speaks is ever wasted, but it requires our yes. There are levels of obedience. The first is obedience when it is easy, when it makes sense, when it aligns with our desires. But the deeper level is obedience when it hurts, when it costs, when it stretches. That is where faith is truly tested. If God tells you to give when you feel you have little, do you trust that He is your provider? If God tells you to step out when you feel unqualified, do you trust that He will equip you? If God tells you to let go of a relationship you cherish, do you trust that His plan is better? Obedience is not only about hearing, but also about surrendering control, laying down our agenda for His will. That is why Jesus prayed, not my will, but yours be done. That was the ultimate model of obedience. And because of that obedience, salvation was manifested for all. It is important to understand that revelation always precedes manifestation. God does not manifest what he has not revealed, because manifestation without revelation would confuse us. It would misalign us. He first gives a word, a dream, a vision, a conviction, so that when obedience produces fruit, we recognize that it was him. The revelation creates accountability. It reminds us of what he said, so that when obedience feels hard, we have an anchor. That anchor is necessary because obedience often leads through seasons of testing. Sometimes you obey and things don't look immediately better. In fact, sometimes they look worse. That does not mean the revelation was false. It means the process is at work. Obedience is the bridge, but bridges often stretch over valleys, rivers, or obstacles. Walking across a bridge is not always instant. It takes steps, it takes courage, it takes consistency. But every step of obedience is moving you closer to manifestation. One of the greatest tragedies is when people receive revelation, but never live to see manifestation because they stop at hearing. Hearing without doing is like admiring blueprints without ever building the house. You can study it, memorize it, talk about it, but unless you act on it, you will never live in it. That is why Jesus said the wise man is the one who hears his words and does them, building on rock, while the foolish man is the one who hears but does not do, building on sand. Both heard, but only one obeyed, and only one stood firm when storms came. The strength of your foundation is not in the revelation you carry, but in the obedience you walk out. Obedience is also communal. Our obedience is never just about us. When you obey, others are blessed. When Abraham obeyed, nations were birthed. When Moses obeyed, a people were delivered. When Esther obeyed, a generation was preserved. When Jesus obeyed, humanity was redeemed. Your obedience has ripple effects. Someone else's breakthrough may be tied to your yes. Someone else's prayer may be answered because you chose to act. Someone else's destiny may be unlocked because you did not delay. This is why disobedience is costly not only to us, but to those connected to us. The bridge we build in obedience does not only carry us, it carries generations. This is why God is so insistent about obedience. He knows that every revelation he gives is a seed for manifestation, but the seed must pass through the soil of obedience. Without that soil, the seed remains dormant. Obedience is sometimes painful because it requires death to self, but it is also the place of resurrection power, where what was unseen becomes seen, where what was promised becomes reality, where heaven touches earth. To obey God is to allow heaven to have jurisdiction in your life. It is to permit the divine to invade the natural, to allow what is written in eternity to manifest in time. Purpose unfolds in seasons, not in moments. And this truth is often the most difficult for us to embrace because we live in a world addicted to immediacy. We crave instant results, instant recognition, instant fulfillment. Yet God does not operate on the timelines of human impatience. Purpose is not a single moment of glory. It is a progressive revelation of who you are becoming in God and what he has called you to steward on the earth. When you understand that purpose is seasonal, you no longer despise the process. You no longer measure your life by one breakthrough, and you no longer compare your journey to the timeline of another. Each season carries its own assignment, its own lessons, its own stretching, its own treasures hidden in the soil of time. To miss the purpose of one season is to compromise the manifestation of the next, because every season is preparation for the one that follows. When God creates, he moves in order. In Genesis, he did not create humanity before creating light, land, water, and provision. He set the stage before placing his image, bearers in it. This is a picture of how he unfolds our purpose. He is always aligning circumstances, relationships, opportunities, and even challenges to shape the environment in which our purpose can be fulfilled. But he does not give it all at once, because receiving the full weight of destiny in a single moment would overwhelm us. Instead, he leads us step by step, season by season, so that by the time we step in the fullness of our calling, we have the character, the resilience, and the faith to sustain it. Purpose is not about arrival. It is about progression. It is not about one climactic event, but about a journey of obedience, trust, and growth. There are seasons of obscurity where purpose is hidden, where it feels as though nothing significant is happening, and yet those seasons are deeply sacred. They are the seasons where roots are formed, where foundations are laid, where your relationship with God becomes unshakable. Jesus himself spent 30 years in preparation for 3 years of public ministry. The world may not see the fruit of those years, but heaven counted every moment. Obscurity is not punishment, it is preparation. When you embrace that season, you stop striving for visibility and start leaning into intimacy. God hides you not to deny you, but to preserve you until the appointed time. Then there are seasons of exposure where the gifts God has cultivated in private begin to bless others in public. These seasons carry both opportunity and responsibility. When your purpose begins to shine before others, it is tempting to believe that you have arrived, but exposure is only one phase of the journey. It is not the fullness of purpose. It is a stage in the unfolding. Exposure tests your motives. It asks, are you doing this for applause or for obedience? Are you rooted in God enough to handle both criticism and praise? Exposure without maturity can destroy, but when you understand that it is a season, you hold it with open hands, knowing that the same God who brought you there may lead you into another season that looks different. There are also seasons of pruning where God removes what no longer serves your growth. These seasons are often painful because pruning cuts away branches that once bore fruit, but they are necessary to prepare you for greater harvest. Purpose requires capacity, and capacity cannot increase without pruning. In these seasons, relationships may shift, opportunities may close, doors you thought were permanent may suddenly be sealed, and it is easy to misinterpret these changes as rejection. Yet in truth, pruning is evidence that you are fruitful, because only fruitful trees are pruned. God prunes because he sees what is ahead, and he knows that to carry the next level of your assignment, you cannot remain as you are. Every cut is making space for expansion. Every removal is protecting you from distraction. Every change is aligning you with destiny. There are seasons of acceleration where what you sowed in faith begins to multiply rapidly. These are moments when doors open that you could not have forced, when favor places you in rooms you did not even knock on, when your efforts seem to produce results beyond your capacity. Acceleration is not random. It is the fruit of previous seasons of faithfulness. What looks slow suddenly shifts into overflow, and you realize that God was never delaying you. He was building you. In acceleration, you must remain grounded because momentum can be intoxicating. If you mistake momentum for mastery, you will burn out. Acceleration is a gift, but it is still a season. It does not define your entire purpose. It propels you into the next dimension of it. Purpose also unfolds in seasons of waiting, where it feels like everything is at a standstill. These seasons test your trust in God's timing. Waiting is not passive, it is active trust. It is the stretching of faith. It is the strengthening of endurance. In waiting, you learn patience, you learn surrender, you learn to depend not on outcomes, but on God himself. Waiting seasons can be the most frustrating because you feel ready, but God says not yet. They are the seasons where you question whether the revelation was real, whether the promise will ever manifest, whether you missed the sign. Yet waiting is one of the holiest seasons because it strips you of self-reliance. In waiting, you learn that purpose is not about performance, but about presence. It is in waiting that you encounter God most deeply. And it is in waiting that he often gives you clarity that will sustain you when the pace quickens again. The beauty of understanding purpose in seasons is that it frees you from the burden of perfection. You no longer feel pressure to accomplish everything at once because you realize that God has ordered your steps. Each season is significant, even when it feels insignificant. The lessons of one season are the very tools you will need in the next. David's season as a shepherd prepared him for his season as a king. Without learning faithfulness in hidden places, he would not have had the courage to face Goliath. Without facing Goliath, he would not have had the credibility to lead a nation. Every season was connected, and none of them could be skipped. To resist a season is to weaken your preparation for the next. Purpose in seasons also teaches us humility because no matter how anointed, gifted, or prepared you are, you cannot bypass God's timing. You cannot demand harvest in the season of planning. You cannot demand elevation in the season of breaking. You cannot demand clarity in the season of mystery. Humility acknowledges that God is the author of the story and we are participants. He sees the whole picture while we only see fragments. Trusting the seasons of purpose is trusting the heart of God, believing that he knows when to reveal, when to hide, when to prune, when to accelerate. When you look at life through this lens, even your failures and detours take on new meaning. What looked like a wasted season may actually have been preparation. The job you hated may have developed discipline. The heartbreak you endured may have cultivated empathy. The wilderness you survived may have birthed resilience. Nothing is wasted in God's economy. Every season, whether joyful or painful, is woven into the tapestry of purpose. Even when you cannot understand the reason, you can trust that God is using it to form you, to shape you, to mature you for what is ahead. Purpose unfolding in seasons also requires discernment because every season carries its own instructions. In some seasons, God says move. In others, he says be still. In some seasons, he says speak. In others, he says listen. In some seasons, he says build. In others, he says rest. Discernment keeps you aligned because doing the right thing in the wrong season can be as damaging as doing the wrong thing altogether. The Israelites tried to enter the promised land after God had already said no, and they were defeated. Timing matters as much as obedience. To discern the season is to know what God is emphasizing now, what he is asking of you today, and to walk in step with his spirit. If you truly embrace that purpose is seasonal, you will no longer compare your chapter to someone else's chapter. You will not envy those in their season of acceleration while you are in your season of waiting, because you understand that their timeline is not your timeline. You will not despise your season of pruning while others are in their season of exposure, because you understand that God is working uniquely in your life. Comparison loses its grip when you realize that purpose unfolds differently for everyone, and the only question that matters is whether you are faithful in your current season. God's path requires surrender before it produces fruit. And this is the paradox that often challenges the human heart, because we are conditioned to believe that progress comes by striving, by controlling, by holding tightly to our own plans and efforts. Yet in the kingdom of God, fruitfulness is birthed not through control, but through surrender. Surrender is the posture that allows God to work through us rather than us working for him. It is the letting go of our limited perspective so that his unlimited wisdom can guide us. It is the acknowledgement that our ways, no matter how carefully crafted, can never compare to his ways, and our thoughts, no matter how strategic, can never reach the height of his thoughts. Surrender is not passive resignation, but active trust. The deliberate choice to yield our will so that his will can flow through our lives. Every story of purpose in Scripture begins with surrender. Abraham surrendered his homeland to walk into an unknown territory. Moses surrendered his excuses to confront Pharaoh. Esther surrendered her safety to stand before the king. Mary surrendered her reputation to carry what she could not explain. Jesus surrendered his divinity to walk among us and ultimately surrendered his life to redeem humanity. Without surrender, revelation remains theory and purpose remains dormant. Surrender is the soil in which fruit is grown, and without that soil, no matter how rich the seed of purpose is, it cannot take root and multiply. The difficulty of surrender lies in our desire for certainty. We want God to reveal the entire blueprint before we release control. We want the security of knowing the outcome before we take the step. Yet God rarely works that way because certainty leaves no room for faith. He calls us to trust him one step at a time, surrendering not the entire journey all at once, but every decision, every choice, every crossroad. This incremental surrender teaches dependence. It shapes us to recognize that God is not only the destination, but the guide. If he were to reveal everything at once, we would attempt to walk it out in our own strength. By asking for surrender, he ensures that we remain aligned, that we walk in intimacy, that we never mistake the blessing for the source. Surrender is also the place where pride dies. Pride convinces us that we can manage on our own, that our wisdom is sufficient, that our plans are superior. Surrender confronts pride by requiring us to lay down what we think is best. It humbles us to admit that we do not see the full picture. It teaches us that control is an illusion and that the only safe hands for our lives are the hands of the one who created them. In surrender, there is a breaking of self-will, but in that breaking comes the freedom to be reshaped by God. A vessel cannot be filled until it is emptied, and lives cannot be filled with divine purpose until they are emptied of self. This does not mean surrender is painless. In fact, surrender often feels like loss. It feels like letting go of dreams, ambitions, relationships, or identities we have built. It feels like walking away from what is familiar without knowing what lies ahead. It feels like silence when we want answers and waiting when we want speed. But it is in this tension that surrender refines us. It strips us of attachments that were never meant to carry us. It detaches us from idols we may not have realized we held. It forces us to confront our fears and insecurities, bringing them into the light of God's presence where they are healed. What feels like loss is actually the making of capacity, because only in emptying can there be room for God to deposit something greater. The fruit of surrender cannot be seen immediately. Just as a seed must die in the soil before it produces a harvest, so must our will be buried before God's will blossoms. There is a hiddenness to surrender, a process where nothing looks like it is changing, and yet everything is shifting beneath the surface. This hidden work is critical, because without it, the fruit would be shallow and unsustainable. When we bypass surrender, we may still produce results, but they will be limited, temporary, and unable to withstand pressure. True fruit, the kind that remains, the kind that multiplies beyond our lifetime, is only birthed through surrendered lives. Surrender is not a one-time event, but a continual lifestyle. Each stage of purpose will require a fresh yes, a deeper release, a greater trust. What you surrendered yesterday may not be enough for today because God continues to call you higher, deeper, further. Abraham had to surrender more than once. First his homeland, then his nephew, then his own son on the altar. Each surrender positioned him for greater revelation of who God is. In the same way, our lives will be marked by progressive surrender, each act expanding our capacity for fruitfulness. Surrender also transforms the way we define success. Without surrender, we measure success by numbers, accolades, or achievements. With surrender, success is measured by obedience. It is no longer about how much we accomplish, but about whether we are aligned with God's will. A surrendered life can appear unimpressive to the world, yet in heaven it echoes with significance. Jesus' surrender on the cross looked like defeat, yet it produced the greatest victory in history. What looks small in human eyes can be immeasurable in God's economy when it flows from surrender. The path of surrender also requires trust in God's character. We will not release what we believe is safer in our hands unless we are convinced that His hands are better. This is why intimacy with God is essential. The more we know Him, the easier it becomes to trust Him. The more we encounter His faithfulness, the easier it becomes to surrender. Every testimony of His goodness is fuel for greater surrender because we remember that He has never failed and He will not start now. When fear rises, intimacy reminds us that He is trustworthy. When doubt lingers, intimacy reminds us that He is consistent. Trust is the bedrock of surrender, and without trust, surrender feels impossible. Another dimension of surrender is the relinquishing of outcomes. We often want to dictate not only what God does, but how and when He does it. Surrender requires us to release not just the action, but the result. It is saying, God, I will obey even if the outcome does not match my expectation. It is yielding control over timing, process, and appearance, believing that His plan is better even when it unfolds differently than ours. This is the ultimate test, because surrender is easiest when God's will aligns with our desires. The true depth of surrender is revealed when His will diverges from ours, and we choose His way regardless. Surrender is also the gateway to peace. The weight of carrying our own lives, of forcing doors open, of manipulating outcomes, produces anxiety and restlessness. But when we surrender, the burden shifts. Jesus said His yoke is easy and His burden is light, because surrender transfers responsibility from us to Him. We no longer have to orchestrate every detail. We only have to trust and obey. Peace flows not from control, but from release. In surrender, we discover rest because we recognize that we are not the source of our purpose. God is. The fruit of surrender manifests not only in personal transformation, but also in impact. A surrendered life becomes a conduit for God's power, love, and wisdom to flow freely. When you surrender your gifts, they multiply beyond what you could have achieved alone. When you surrender your relationships, they align in ways you could not have orchestrated. When you surrender your plans, doors open that you could not have imagined. Surrender does not diminish your life. It enlarges it. It allows God to do exceedingly abundantly above all you could ask or think, because you have yielded your limited vision for His infinite plan. Surrender also protects us from the deception of self-reliance. When we believe we are the source of our success, we risk building kingdoms that crumble. But when we surrender, we are constantly reminded that the fruit is not ours but His. This keeps us humble, grounded, and dependent. It prevents us from idolizing our own achievements, and it directs all glory back to the one who deserves it. Fruitfulness without surrender breeds pride. Fruitfulness through surrender produces worship. There is also a corporate dimension to surrender. Communities, churches, even nations are shaped by the surrendered yes of individuals. One person's surrender can shift the trajectory of many lives. When Moses surrendered, an entire nation walked into freedom. When Paul surrendered, the gospel reached the Gentiles. When ordinary men and women throughout history surrendered, revivals broke out, institutions were built, and cultures were transformed. The fruit of surrender is never confined to the individual. It always multiplies outward, touching those around them and beyond.